Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Intentional Conversations VodCast. We're just giving it a minute or so now that we're at the top of the hour, allowing guests to get settled in to this virtual learning space. We're so grateful that you all have dedicated this time to be with us. We don't take that for granted. And we do commit to a rich hour full of great discussion and dialogue. And we're just so happy you're here. Please take to the chat and let us know where you're joining the conversation from. It's always a treat for us to be able to know where people are joining the conversation from. We know that we have people all throughout the US and even some global community members that join us week after week, and we're so grateful for that. I am Dr. Nika White, and my pronouns are she, her, and I serve as the founder and lead principal consultant for NWC. And today I am being supported by the NWC team, who I'm so grateful for, and who do a tremendous job in ensuring this virtual experience is exceptional for all of us that partake. And so I'm truly grateful. I also want to let you know that as we're leveraging the chat today, let's see that as a way to extend community to each other. And so if I say something or our guest co-host says something that really resonates with you, take to the chat and share those sentiments, those thoughts. If you have questions or resources that you want to share with this community, then certainly go to the chat. We love being able to share with this community. And we will be able to give you an opportunity to also center your voice if you desire today. We'll be opening it up for questions and contributions from our community here. I also want to acknowledge that we are live on LinkedIn. So for all of you who are joining us via LinkedIn, certainly use the comments area to share your thoughts. My team is watching that, and we're bringing all of those expressions into this live VodCast community. And we're so grateful to be able to do so. So once again, welcome to Intentional Conversations VodCast, where we intersect conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership in business. Welcome. Okay, once again, if you're just joining us, I am Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, and you have joined Intentional Conversations VodCast, which is brought to you by NWC, Nika White Consulting. This is where we intersect conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership and business. Cameras today are highly encouraged, but certainly not required. We love to see smiling faces, but if you're here just in an auditory capacity or just observing and wanting to pick up some great nuggets, we welcome you nonetheless, and we're so grateful that you have decided to spend this hour with us. We also have closed caption that has been enabled for those that will benefit from that. That's our way of showing up for disability inclusion. And so we hope that you feel welcomed in our space today. Many of you are aware that for the last several months, we have been taking our VodCast content and we have been making the audio available in a podcast capacity. So I continue to share that because I know that while many of you enjoy being live and hearing the information firsthand, many also go back and watch the replays, and then some even like to get their content in podcast capacity. And so whatever it is that you feel is going to best allow you to connect with this community, then certainly take advantage of that, but want you to know of all the options so that you also can spread the word to those who are in your networks that you feel would gain value for being connected to our Intentional Conversations community. Here at NWC, we like to certainly recognize, different national observances that are taking place, and Trans Awareness Week is this week. And so we certainly want to highlight that. We hope that you all will take an opportunity to do what you can to be an ally to the trans community, learning more about their challenges, their pain points, their success stories, and just being standing in solidarity in whatever ways that you can. And so as always, while we like to acknowledge those national observances, we often like to say that doesn't mean that that is the only time that we should be leaning in to our allyship of those very specific communities. And so make sure that you're taking opportunities all throughout the year to stand in solidarity with the trans community. Now, I am a little sad, but also excited to announce that today is the final Intentional Conversations for 2022. Let me make sure I say that again, for 2022. We will be back in 2023 with a great lineup of wonderful guest co-hosts. In fact, we're already completely booked for Q1 and we are getting booked for Q2. But if you have a recommendation of someone that you would like to see added to our roster of guest co-hosts, please send that information to us. And you can send it to my colleague, Amora Carter at nikawhite.com. We will be pausing for the holiday season and returning in January, recharged, ready to go with great new content. And so we hope that you will also, just keep this in mind so that when we return, we have an audience that we are communicating with, because we really do enjoy your participation and your support of Intentional Conversations. Now, for those of you who've been a part of this community, you know that I always like to take an opportunity before I bring on our guest co-host to provide a formal introductions. I want you all to know the accolades, the credentials, all of the great experience that our co-hosts bring to our Intentional Conversations VodCast discussion. And so today will be no different. And after I will present our guest co-host today, I then will give her an opportunity to unmute herself and to greet you in her own way. I'm super excited. It's been a long time coming, but I want you all to help me welcome my friend, Neha Sampat. Neha is a CEO and founder of Belong Lab, where she helps organizations create cultures of belonging, into which each individual can bring more of their true and best self through consulting, training, speaking, and writing. She helps organizations address hidden barriers to belonging, such as internalized bias, unconscious bias, distrust in teams, and wellness challenges. She is an internationally sought-after expert on inclusive leadership and disrupting imposter syndrome, and she runs the top-rated Owning Your Value programs to cultivate evidence-based confidence and nurture authenticity. Neha's insights have been featured in Harvard Business Review, Time Magazine, Thrive Global, ABA Journal, News India Times, and numerous other professional publications and media. Neha holds a BS in sociology and political science from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, obtained her JD from UC Berkeley School of Law, and holds a certificate in graduate applied psychology. Neha works across industry from Amazon to Pixar and UC Berkeley to numerous top global law firms. Neha also relishes and learns from her role as a mama to her 2 kiddos. And you can learn more about her work at www.belonglab.com. We'll place that into the chat. And you can follow her on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook at Belong Lab, and on LinkedIn. And it is, we'll place actually her link to LinkedIn into the chat so that you all can connect with her. But VodCast community, you know what we do right now. We find whatever ways we can through the emojis, through the celebrations and expressions in the chat. But I want you to help me welcome my friend Neha. Let her know that we appreciate her stopping by today and being a part of our conversation. So Neha, I am going to now spotlight you so that the world, and I'm saying the world because we truly believe that the reach of Intentional Conversations VodCast is very broad, can see who you are. But I want you to just greet this audience in your own way. And we often like to ask our guest co-hosts to make sure that as they're thinking about what they want to share is to consider maybe some of those tidbits that perhaps people would not know about you from reading your bio. So what else can we glean about Neha? Welcome, my friend.
Oh my gosh, Dr. White, thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. I have been engaging with the VodCast on the other side of it, and this is really a great honor for me. So thank you, and thank you everyone for the warm welcome. I'm delighted to see a lot of familiar folks and some new friends. So delighted to be a part of this community. Oh goodness, I was blushing through my brown skin as you gave me that intro. It's interesting. When I do my programs on owning your value, I make the point that there's this like in front of the curtain introduction of us, all the like internationally sought after speakers, blah, 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 right? All of it's true. And I'm so proud of and honored by my career and the trajectory of it and where I've taken it. All of it's true. But what's so fascinating is, and I think you alluded to this in a way, there's this whole part of ourselves that isn't in those intros, right? That's the behind the curtain part of ourselves. And a lot of the work that we do at Belong Lab is about pulling the curtain back and being able to share more of our whole selves. So I really appreciate you welcoming all your guests in that way and welcoming me today in that way. So gosh, what do I want to share? Let me think. You mentioned I'm a mom. I love to write, so I'm a writer. I am not a good little Indian girl, which was very much expected of me. So I'm
You
not
get in
that.
good trouble.
Look for that. You're not going to get that. I'm an empath. I am a chronic migrainer. So I have chronic migraine and am part of the disability community and the chronic illness community via that challenge in my life. Let me think. I am someone who's accomplished all those cool things, but also someone who has epically messed up. So I'm a messer upper. I have failed at a number of things. I continue to fail at things, and I try to share some of those failures. Like here, I'll give you a great one today because bar results for our young lawyers just came out this month. I failed the bar the first time I took it, and it was such a difficult situation for me as someone who really identified as very academically strong and nerdy. But that was a real kind of formative failure for me, if you want to call it that, a formative failure. So I definitely mess up a lot, but I'm always trying to do better. So I don't call myself a do-gooder. I call myself a do-betterer, which allows me to have room to mess up. I am a bias buster, a belonging builder. I'm a boat rocker. I lost my voice for a good chunk of my life and was so grateful to find it again around the time I hit 40. And now that I found it, I use it. So I'm delighted to get to use it with you here today.
That is so beautiful. So much of what you said really resonates with me. One of the things that I've always admired about you, Neha, since we've been connected, particularly from a virtual perspective and connected around this space and this work, is how authentic you are, how transparent you are. And, you know, one of the first questions I asked you when we, before the top of the hour, when we connected for today's podcast is, I've learned a lot from you. And so I asked you, how are you doing today? It's because I know that you do suffer chronically from migraines, and you're so open about that. And if I could just say, you have taught me how to be much more intentional about not making assumptions that people are, just because they're showing up and they appear to be fully present and fully well, that they are fully well, right? And so I love that lesson that you've taught me, and I appreciate that. It was one of the reasons why I asked you when we first connected today, how are you doing today? That was really important for me. So I just wanted to thank you, because it was because of you that now I feel so inclined to be intentional about asking the questions, especially when people are as transparent and open about some of their challenges. And so I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. It really meant so much to me that you asked that, because you immediately drew in that wholer part of me into our conversation right off the bat. And you also let me know that you've been reading my tweets. So my personal Twitter account is where I talk a lot about my struggle with my chronic illness. And it really talk about creating safety for someone to be authentic. You did a great job of that. And I want to appreciate you for that.
Oh, no, absolutely. 100%. Okay, so let's jump right in. I love the name Belong Lab, by the way, and I love the fact that you have centered, your work on very explicitly trying to bring greater intentionality around the belonging aspect of this broad work. And so give us a little bit about the type of clients or maybe organizations and type of work and projects that Belong Lab engages in on a routine basis.
Oh, wow. Gosh, you're going to have to stop me because I'm going to talk too much. I can already warn you.
Okay. We want to hear it all.
You in the intro kind of laid it out. We create cultures of belonging. We help organizations create cultures of belonging into which each person can bring more of their true and best self. We know that there is no belonging for any of us unless we can bring more of our true and best self to our work, and to our lives. So on the organizational end, that ends up looking like a lot of work on the creating safety, on the shifting structures to be more inclusive. It looks like inclusive leadership trainings and keynotes. So I do a lot of speaking these days. It looks like consulting with leadership on how to shake up systems. It looks like all sorts of, it looks like the work I do on LinkedIn and the posts I do on LinkedIn, and other social media. And on the individual part, there's that whole part about creating a space for people to feel safe and emboldened to bring their true and best self to their work. So we do a lot of work inspiring and empowering individuals in organizations to not, you can't even start at bringing your best true and best self to your work, because for many of us, me having been one of those people, many of us have forgotten who our true and best selves are, because we have had to play this game that was not created by us or for us. For me, it looked like, when I said to you that I found my voice and now I'm using it, for me, it looked like I became so good at telling people what they wanted to hear, because that's what it took for me as a brown girl, a daughter of immigrants, growing up in what was then a very white and racist suburb of Chicago. It took me reading people really well and telling them what they wanted to hear for me to even get by. The problem, I became so good at that at some point I forgot what I wanted to say. And that's a huge problem. So the journey really starts for many of us in actually a lot of deep self-reflection and figuring out, who is it that I am? What are the parts of myself I have been cutting off in order to fit into these molds that weren't created by me or for me? And then once you figure that out, then you can think about, how do you bring that to the world in a way that is not too risky for you? So we do a lot of work on that kind of individual level, but of course also on the organizational level. Substantively, it looks like programs busting bias, because we know that bias is one of the biggest barriers to belonging. So we work on stopping the harm that's directed against other people, and providing healing from the harm for people who have suffered from harm, being on the receiving end.
No, I love that. One of the things that, Alfred actually highlighted this into the chat, but as you were talking about listening to me, present you and read your bio, blushing while brown. And what I love about that is you are walking the talk. And what I mean is, in your bio, I talked about the fact that, your program, owning your value, you give people permission to own their own value by the way in which you receive the recognition, the facts that are being presented about you and the work that you've done and what you've accomplished. And so I want to lean into that a bit. And I would love for you to talk about this program, why it's important, and how you have designed it to really create the outcomes that you sought after when you were creating this program.
I really appreciate how you framed that, because, well, one, you're so right. And I appreciate that you recognize something that took a lot of intentionality for me and continues to take a lot of intentionality, which is to receive, right? Like I'm blushing through my brown skin, and I'm always startled to hear that kind of intro of me, even though I wrote, right, my bio. But it's startling, because we're not used to, particularly, I think I can speak as a woman, I can speak as a brown woman, I can speak as an American woman of Indian descent. There's all these different layers of my identity that make it deeply uncomfortable for me to bask in the glory of my accomplishments, right? Like I'm not supposed to do that. When I do that, I'm being arrogant, quote unquote. It's a bad look on someone who looks like me to be like, hey, you know what? I'm an internationally sought after speaker. I didn't even put that in my bio. Rita Gibbons-Bird, my colleague at Belong Lab, was the one who told me, Neha, you're not a nationally sought after speaker anymore. You're an internationally sought after speaker.
Thank you, Rita.
Thank you, Rita. Totally. And see, I needed that from her, because we're not accustomed to doing that. So I appreciate calling that out, because for me, owning my value, it's a risk. It's a risk for many of us every single day, especially when it comes to showing our value. We break down owning our value into three aspects. So one is you have to know your value in order to own your value. Two, you have to grow your value. Always be learning, always be open to others' expertise and perspectives and identities. And you always have to be showing your value. And the showing your value is where we get a lot of judgment based on whatever biases there might be against us. So I appreciate you calling that out. Now, the importance of it, I don't even know where to start. I think even just when we think about busting stereotypes, I think about every time I'm about to post something on LinkedIn about an accomplishment that Belong Lab has had, or perhaps something I'm proud of, I sit for a second, because I know that as soon as I hit post on that, it's going to turn off some people. It's going to turn off some people. People are going to be like, who does she think she is? Wow, she talks about herself a lot, But then I have to remind myself, it's up to me. I can afford to take more risks now. I'm 3 decades into my career. I'm not a junior where the risks are much higher. I hold a lot of privilege that I need to leverage in order to create a new model of what it means to be a brown woman. Guess what? Brown women speak the truth about their accomplishments. That's what I want the future to be. I want my daughter to not feel like she has to make herself small publicly. And so that is my kind of decision point nudge. That's like, this is one of the reasons we have to own our value, to allow all the people that come after us to do that. And then, of course, there's the simple things like, I wouldn't have the trust of my clients if I wasn't able to tell them, you can trust me because I have done Y and Z and I got this.
Neha, I feel so seen right now. I really do, because everything that you just said completely resonates with me, as also as a brown, as a Black woman, I have had a lot of trepidation around what do I share, right? And I love the fact that you said speaking truth about your accomplishments. Some would call that bragging, but it ain't bragging if it's true, and if it happened.
Right.
Exactly. Yes, and I think there's a difference between bragging and flagging, and the reframe there is so important because it helps us to realize, no, we aren't bragging, we aren't being arrogant, we are flagging what our value is, to your point, what we have to offer, and why our words are and the content that we share is something that can be trusted. I've experienced this. I've worked hard for whatever kind of credentials that I have built up to be able to speak as a voice of authority on this topic. And so I love that. I also want to take note of the 3 elements that you shared about owning your values. I want to make sure this audience got it because it was so good. You have to know your value. You have to grow your value, and you have to show your value, right? That is just so beautiful. I love that completely. Is there anything else you want to share with us before I move to the next question about this owning your value program? Can individuals just kind of sign up and say, yes, I could value going through that experience? Or is it more like a program that you do for individuals within respective organizations that they belong to? How does this work?
Yeah, it's usually through organizations. And thank you for asking. Actually, not just one program, it's a suite of programs. So there are a number of programs that are all geared towards helping organizations value the people they have, see and truly value them, because that is what true belonging requires, not just being seen, but being valued and actually even being celebrated. And then, of course, helps the individuals in the organization bring more of their true and best selves to their work. So what that looks like programmatically is addressing self-doubt, which is really counter to owning your value. And we dig into a particular brand of self-doubt that is very insidious. So a lot of our programs are geared towards busting imposter syndrome and building evidence-based confidence. You talked about truth telling. I think we both have been talking about that. And that's what this is. This is about not fake it till you make it confidence. This is about evidence-based true confidence. So we do workshops and keynotes to inspire people to actually figure out how to recognize when self-doubt is creeping up for them, how to understand where it comes from. Because the truth is, for many of us, it comes from biases that have been directed against us.
Of course.
Right? All those voices that have told us in some way or another, who do you think you are, can become that voice in our own heads. Who do I think I am? So this is a bias issue. This is an inclusion and equity issue. This is a well-being issue. So it kind of lives at the intersection of inclusion, well-being, and leadership development. So it's a beautiful bang for your buck topic. And then as far as other programs, we also recognize that it's not on those of us who have been harmed by these messages of bias to fix everything. We have room to heal. That's how I like to look at it. But we have to actually stop the harm from happening in the first place as organizations. So the other part of our programs and owning your value are really geared towards inclusive leadership. How do we empower leaders in the organization to cultivate a culture that reduces instead of feeds self-doubt? So both organizational, structural leadership, and really honing in on the individual.
I like that. And I often say that this work, the work of being able to show up at your best and contribute all of your talents and your skill sets that really can lead towards, transformative change. It starts at the personal level. So I love that it's not just about what are we doing from an organizational perspective, but how do we also fix the individuals that are in these organizations that can certainly gain value from deepening their belief system of their worth and their value so that they can really lean into that and contribute all of that to the world. You talk about imposter syndrome. I think that probably so many of us can think about so many situations, particularly if we're part of one of those historically marginalized communities. We can have so many examples as to how imposter syndrome has created harm for us, right? Kept us out of different, opportunities and caused us to shrink back. And, I have a session that I do that is entitled Imposter Syndrome, a Misdiagnosis. And it goes back to exactly what you were saying. It's the bias. It's the bias and it's the systems and the bias in the systems and not necessarily us. But we then reflect it as something is wrong with us. We're not adequate enough. We're not sufficient. So again, I just love the reframe and helping us to get to the crux of really what the issue is, because that's where it starts to help us unravel that it's not us. It's not us. And I can stand in my truth and my value. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. And I appreciate what you said about the individual and because I think we've shifted the conversation in DEIB in a very important way over the past couple of years. And to recognize that many of these problems are structural and systemic. And so they're actually, you have to shake up the systems. You can empower a bunch of individuals along the way, but if you're not actually shaking down the systems, creating new systems, we're not going to get to where we want to go. But what I worry about, and I think this just kind of, you helped me figure this out. So thank you, Dr. White. What I worry about is that in making that shift, I worry that we've somehow absolved ourselves of responsibility. And I think that it's important to remember that systems are made up of people. And how systems get perpetuated? They get perpetuated by us and them and everybody else. And so what is our role? Let's recognize that these are systemic issues, but what is each of our role in shaking up the system? And that's the other beauty of the Owning Your Value program, is that you're not gonna rock the boat and shake a system, because that's risky, that's big.
Yeah. And you're not gonna do it by yourself.
You're not gonna do it by yourself, and you're not gonna even feel emboldened to do that unless you have that confidence in yourself and your abilities. So that's another kind of connection with the work into the systemic change. But I really appreciate that. And you're absolutely right. Like, what I see happen with people who experience imposter syndrome is we often compound our misery by blaming ourselves. We're already feeling crappy about ourselves because I'm not doing this, I can't do this. Like, those are the narratives that imposter syndrome has in our head. I'm not good enough. And then we compound it with, and it's my fault I feel this way, which is completely wrong. It is not your fault you feel that way. You have been bombarded with messages throughout a lifetime that tell you you're not good enough, that lie to you and tell you you're not good enough. So the fault is not yours. So I really appreciate you teasing that out.
Yeah, no, that confidence piece is so critical. So I love the connection point there, because, you described yourself as, I'm a boat rocker. And so many people, they need that confidence to rock the boat, but there are some people who are part of systems and organizations where they need to flip the boat. And so think about the higher level of confidence that's required to do that, because the risk is even greater, right? Yeah. And I'm so really aligned with your thought process around how in which we need to make sure that people at the personal level don't try to absolve themselves of being a part of the solution. And you're right. It's almost like when we talk about bias, we try to fix bias in processes, but we also have to fix bias in people. And so it's a both and. It's not an either or, but a both and. Absolutely. So I want to go back to what you were sharing, Neha, about really trying to address the harm that's already happened. So how can you coach someone to heal from harm and trauma that has happened as a result of bias in the form of internalized bias? Because that's where it shows up as well.
That's a really good question. I think the first step, and this probably is the most difficult step for many of us, is to see that what we've experienced is actually trauma for many of us. Yeah. That's not what we've been told by our society. We've been gaslit usually to believe the opposite, right? We've been gaslit to be like, oh, you're making a bigger deal out of this than it is. Oh no, that's not racist, what they just did or said to you. And if you're like me, I grew up experiencing self-gaslighting as a form of internalized bias. So in order to cope with all this bias that was directed against me, and as a kid, it was like racial bullying, right? And I would convince myself that it wasn't racial bullying because it was too painful for me to acknowledge that these people don't like me because of the color of my skin. That's such a painful realization. So my coping mechanism back then was to self-gaslight myself. Like I remember my mom would call it out, strange things would happen in school. I remember there was some honors breakfast and I was somehow left off the list, even though my grades were high enough. And my mom's like, who else was invited? And it turned out like I'm the only brown kid that wasn't invited and I should have been invited. And she's like, that something is up here. And I was like, no, Mom, something's not up. It was an innocent mistake, right? Like you make excuses because the truth is so painful. So I think we have to be able to see the painful truths in order to understand what we're dealing with, that what we're dealing with isn't like you kind of said, it's not a personality flaw. If I have imposter syndrome as a form of internalized bias, doesn't mean something's wrong with me. That means that something's wrong with the world around me and I have been harmed and now I need to heal. So the first thing is acknowledging what has happened. The second step is getting to know yourself with grace and wonder. So how do you, like for me, it was looking at those parts of myself I had been cutting off, as I mentioned, in order to try to squeeze myself into this mold that was not created by me or for me. And what actually turns out to be true is that I will never be able to squeeze myself into the mold created by like cisgender straight white men because I'm not a cisgender straight white man, right? And will never fit that mold. But to look at those pieces that for a lifetime I had been cutting off, because those pieces, that's my magic. Those are the parts of me that I am the only human on this planet that has that brand of magic, right? And so starting to think about, instead of leaving that stuff behind, instead of covering that, how can I actually put that in the spotlight and leverage that? How can I honor that as my magic? And when people start to do that, you're going to lose some folks. When I started to come, like I'm very facially expressive. That's a piece of me that I had tried to cut off because, people like talk like this, stand like this, be very polished when you're a public speaker. And that's just not who I am. I'm super casual, super informal. I'm very animated. When I started to leverage that, I remember some people said some not so kind things to me, like, Neha, you've had too much coffee today. Wow, she's too much for me. And guess what? I'm not here to make everybody happy. So those people can go find their person who stands like this and talks like this and is very quote unquote polished. But guess what? When I bring that animation, I find my people because there are people out there with whom that resonates. It's almost like the stories we're the most scared to share. And I think about this in terms of my writing. When I've written personal essays, the stories I've been the most scared to share because I knew that it might turn some people off are the stories that most needed to be heard. Even though I cared about 5 people, there were like 50 people who were moved to tears and connected with me and now are my friends, So I do think that it is about recognizing pieces we've had to cut off and starting to leverage those, starting to take those risks to leverage those come what may.
Yeah, that is so perfect. You have such a way with words. I placed into the chat something that you said that just really stuck with me. Get to know yourself with grace and wonder. Yeah, I just love that. We don't extend enough grace to ourselves. And I think that we aren't curious enough sometimes to dig deeper to understand the why behind why we're feeling what we feel, why we're showing up the way that we are. And if we had a deeper level of curiosity and wonder, I can only imagine how we could be more equipped, better equipped to really reach our full potential and not worry so much about the people who aren't our people, right? Like you talked about folks who they may not like your style, but that's not who really I'm here to please and to speak with, and that's fine. That's okay. So I absolutely love that. So, Neha, you gave us a lot of information about what people can do to begin to address their own healing journey, right? In terms of acknowledging the trauma and the harm. I'm curious about your perspective on what role, if any, should organizations play and take on in helping to address the harm that they are probably aware of has occurred maybe in the workplace that's impacting people and how they're showing up.
Oh, absolutely. Organizations absolutely are responsible because organizations have harmed in some of the most
Right.
negatively impactful ways. I bet a number of us here today, myself included, can think of times that in the workplace, we were held back by something that happened in the workplace that impacted us, that has all these like ripple effects that impacted us, for some of us, for a lifetime. So we cannot overstate the impact of the harm created in our workplaces. And so I do put the onus of responsibility on organizations to provide that, stop harming, of course,
Right.
and provide that healing from the harm, because they're the ones who have actually created the harm in a lot of the ways. So that means creating programs, right, for healing from the harm, and not positioning them as, we need you to fix yourselves. And that's what we see them often positioned as, this idea that we need to make our people of color or our women more confident because they've got a confidence issue. It's like, no, actually, they've been harmed and deserve to heal from that harm. We're not trying to tell them to change themselves. We're actually helping them remember their own amazingness. This isn't about changing someone. So I think that harm framing of it is so important because it really takes the onus off the individuals. It's not about fixing folks, it's about healing. But organizations absolutely need to, through coaching programs, through training programs, through doing programs to stop, even doing programs to stop the harm, provide some healing. Because then we know you're not putting it on us. You realize that it's on you to stop harming. And that makes me feel like you see what's really been happening. So even the stop the harm programs, like the busting unconscious bias programs, all of those, if you do those heartfully, and if everyone shows up all the way through the most senior leadership and really, really buys into it as do betterers, like they're able to own where they've messed up and do better, that actually has an important role in the healing for all of us.
Yeah. Do you think that organizational leaders are connecting the dots, though? And what I mean by that is when we use language like harm and trauma as it relates to the workplace, and I've experienced this, and maybe you have as well, but sometimes those organizational leaders, they begin to question, well, is that my responsibility? We're not therapists, we do have an, employee resource program, and they can, go and connect with a therapist. Because when we use words like healing and harm, organizations tend to believe that, what are you talking about? That's not the space we're in. We're not a social justice entity. That's really some of the conversations that I know I've been a part of when we've talked about healing and trauma in the workplace. It's almost like, well, wait, does that language even fit into this workplace environment? What do you say to those individuals?
I say catch up with us. I think you're right. I think you're right that the market is not really ready for that language. But the market wasn't ready for belonging when you and I started talking about it,
Right.
years ago, right? And it's only because we still took the chance, we believed in it, we started talking about it, and we were part of shifting the market. So I'm a big believer in not going where the market takes us all the time, or really any of the time, but really thinking about what power do I have, what agency do I have to actually educate and shape the market. So I'm really proud to be in a network with people like you and so many others in our community that are like boldly saying, you can tell us you don't want to take on trauma, or that this isn't trauma, or you want to silo exclusion trauma or othering trauma, but you're going to come around in about a year or two, and you're going to wish you had hired us, 2 years earlier. So I'm
Right.
all about it. It's the truth. It's the lived experience of so
Yeah.
many of us. And the more of us that have the power to shout from the rooftops about it, we can shift change. But I'm curious about your thought about it. I really want to hear what your perspective is on that too.
I think it's hard. I think that you're absolutely right. And the reason I asked that question is because I experience it a lot. I think that, language is important, and we know that. And I'm finding that it takes a lot of organizational leaders a while to warm up to the idea that they should be playing in this space of trying to help people heal from trauma and from harm. Right? Because they see that as a separation from the workplace. It's almost as though that's what therapy is for. That's what all these other resources are for. But we're here to make widgets. We're here to, provide this service. It's like it's hard for them to connect the dots. And so I was just really interested in hearing if you have experienced the same, I mean, and you probably have seen a lot of this too, but I've even seen posts on LinkedIn where a lot of organizational leaders will really just refute and discourage people from using language like harm and trauma and toxicity, in the workplace. They don't want to hear it. I don't know if it's because they're putting on, they're wishing maybe that the truth is not the truth, and they're hoping that perhaps if I just ignore it and say it's not true, that it's not going to be true, which we know that's not the case, or if it's just maybe as practitioners, there's another strategy and approach that perhaps we need to be open to help bring them along on that type of conversation. I don't know. So really, one of the things that I like to tell my team all the time is I see these podcasts as professional development for us because we learn every week. I don't know. So I was just really interested in hearing your perspective on that.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate your perspective as well, because it's making me think about how this plays out for me. So we work in all different industries, which is so great. We can transfer best practices from one industry to another. But because I'm trained as a lawyer and I practiced law way back when, I have a lot of clients in the legal profession. Now, the legal profession is very sadly well known to have serious well-being issues. I mean, it is, it's so sad the amount of wellness challenges that lawyers have and how much dissatisfaction they have in their work. This has been going on for decades because the profession is also slow to change, very conservative, risk averse, and slow to change. But what I'm able to leverage in the legal profession, at least, because we know we have this well-being issue, is people are not going to make that point about, oh, your wellness and trauma doesn't really, keep that for home. Because they don't dare do that in the legal profession, because they know that they're under a lot of pressure to actually make some headway and create a more well profession. So I think de-siloing is an important piece of this, right? Like de-siloing DEIB from well-being, de-siloing DEIB from leadership, de-siloing leadership from well-being. Like if they care about, when you talk about connecting the dots, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Where do you connect the dots? I mean, strategically, if they speak leadership, I try to connect the dots between the trauma, and I may not use that word if that is something that is going to shut them down, but I may still describe what is trauma, right? And
Absolutely.
then that's with leadership.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. So I am going to shift momentarily to take questions, comments from this audience. You can share whatever you like to contribute by simply raising your hand, and that lets me know that you are open for me to add you to the spotlight and to invite you to unmute yourself and share. Or if you have a question, comment, contribution, and you just want to share it into the chat, we will also make sure we're paying close attention to bring that into the dialogue. So I'll ask one more question before I will shift. That way I can give this audience an opportunity just to think about maybe what's percolating or curiosities you're holding. You have a LinkedIn newsletter, and it's called Box Breakers, and really rich content that you share. And recently I became aware of your ta-da list, right? So I want you to talk just in general about the type of content that you share and your Box Breakers newsletters, but then also I specifically want us to talk about this ta-da list because I just think it's brilliant. So go for it.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to do that. So Box Breakers newsletter, I welcome folks to join it. Really, the content is about how do we stop being people who check boxes and start being people who break boxes. So it's a lot of fun. It's really enticing, engaging content. And I'd love to have you be part of that community, all of you here today, or listening later. So the first ever post in the Box Breakers newsletter was last December, so December 2021. And I wrote a post about how at the end of the year is the perfect time to turn the page on your massive to-do list that's like haunting you as you get to December, right? You're like, oh crap, it's the end of the year and I haven't done all these things. Oh, remember, what was my word for 2022? Did I even embody that word? I haven't worked out. I better put those workout. We're like frantically trying to make good on the promises we made ourselves at the beginning of the year. And it can really make us feel kind of crappy. And it can actually feed our imposter syndrome. See, I'm not good enough. Like I had all these goals, I didn't meet them. So this is the time in December, November, December, kind of right where we're at. And for this to be the last vodcast of the year, perfect opportunity to turn the page on that to-do list and create a ta-da list. So a ta-da list is not forward looking like a to-do list is. A ta-da list is backward looking. And you're essentially identifying what were your ta-das from this year? What were your accomplishments? What were things that maybe never even lived on your to-do list because they came out of nowhere and slapped you in the face, that you survived, that you managed, that you figured out? All of those things, personal and professional, create a ta-da list. And most importantly, you have to ask yourself for each ta-da, what does that ta-da say about who I am and of what I am capable? That's how you identify your unique qualifications. That's how you start to know your value. When we talk about knowing your value, that's an important way to know your values, not just identifying the ta-da and saying woohoo, although that's important, but also asking yourself, what does this ta-da say about who I am and of what I'm capable? What are my identities, perspectives, skills, strengths that led to that ta-da? And that's the gold. So this is a perfect time of year to do that. Dr. White, let's do it. What do you think? Do you have a ta-da?
Well, I love this so much. I think it's brilliant. And I knew for certain that I wanted us to introduce this idea of, and we can't just say ta-da list. We have to really give it the full effect. Ta-da, right? That's what it is. We're excited about it. It is like something that we're really feeling a lot of energy around, and we want to celebrate it. And we want to allow it to fuel us towards even greater momentum and traction for maybe bigger, loftier goals in the future. Because again, it's all about that confidence so we can show up as our best selves, right? And do the work that we all can do. So I love this. I do have a ta-da. And my ta-da this year, and this is going to be, pretty familiar information to this community because I've been sharing it a lot with the friends in this podcast community, but it was completing book number 3 that is releasing January of 2023. It was completing it. It really was. And even though this is book number 3, in so many ways, I feel like this is book number 1. You know how you write something, then you go back and at the time you think it's just tremendous. And I'm not saying that book number 1 and number 2 were not worthy, because again, I'm standing in my value. It's very worthy content, but I've grown a lot. I've matured a lot in this work, in this space. I've experienced a lot, and I have poured everything that I have and that I know into book number 3. So that is my ta-da, and I cannot wait to its release to the world. And so thank you for giving us this moment just to reflect on our ta-das. I want to invite this community. Go to the chat, y'all. If you're joining us by LinkedIn Live, go to the comment section there. But what is your ta-da? I'm sure there's many, but maybe just pick one to kind of socialize and share with this community. And hopefully this is going to be something that becomes a ripple effect. Maybe we'll start sharing our ta-das with others in our network, our coworkers, our family, our friends, and then everyone else will start doing it too. And
Exactly.
what a beautiful picture that seems to paint in my head, at least, that we're all sharing our ta-das.
I love it. And I have
it.
to say congratulations, Dr. White. This is an opportunity for us all to celebrate as a community too, what other people are going to put in their,
Absolutely.
Your 3rd book, I mean, that is huge. And I have to ask you one question. What is one thing that ta-da says about who you are or of what you're capable?
What
does it say about
who
you?
I am and what I'm capable of. That's such a great question. So I do need to spend some more time and reflection on that. But I think what it says is that first and foremost, I am a person that is worthy of being selected, sought after by a brand like Forbes Publishing to say your voice matters.
Yeah.
And we want you to write this book. We want to publish this book. I think it also says about me that my voice matters, that I do have influence. And so the work that I've been doing is not in vain. And that gives me confidence to keep going at this work that I care so deeply about, right?
That's the
And
goal.
so,
that's beautiful.
yeah. And so if nothing else, I think that confidence piece, which is what you brought to today's conversation, I think I've buried that. I haven't really amplified that in my life. You know, I feel like I'm just naturally an ambitious, driven, confident person. But yeah, I mean, today it's kind of gone up another level. It's like, so thank you. Thank you so much for that. Yes, keep those dots coming. I want to see the chat kind of fill up with them. Well, I do see 2 hands raised and we have 10 minutes left. And so I'm not going to be selfish any longer. I'm going to share Neha with this community. And so Sean, I think I saw your hand go up first. And so I'll invite you to unmute yourself and to share.
Hey, Sean.
Hey, Neha. Good to long time no talk.
Yes, delighted to see you here. Oh my goodness,
Yeah.
This is a gift.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Nika, for having her and for letting me ask my question. And it's just, I want to say this. So before I ask my question, like I just had a very unfortunate situation where I just lost a job and my manager was a woman of color. And it's just really, and that's why like what's going on with, you know, Nika having this platform, having you on here, seeing both of you, a Black woman, an Indian woman, like it's beautiful. And it's just because my situation was just very unfortunate. But Neha, the question I want to ask is, you mentioned something about, you know, finding your voice, you know, having lost it. And you named all the dynamics and components with it that went into you losing it. And now that you've found it and you've tapped back into your power, how do you navigate and balance, you know, that power and your presence that you've rediscovered when you're around other people of color, more specifically, but it doesn't necessarily have to be people of color, you know, but people of color specifically, and just people, period, that may have lost theirs or never found it. You know, like, how do you balance that, you know, between like not shaking them to their core, you know, to now they're scared of you or they see you as a threat. You know what I mean? Because you talked about some of those dynamics.
Yeah, no, yes, thank you. That's such a thought-provoking question. Well, let me first say this. I'm so sorry for what you have gone through. And I think it's, it lands differently when it is a person of our own, you know, that.
Right.
So I just want to point that out, that there's a different complexity and a different experience given what you just described you've gone through. So I want to just give that space and honor that. As far as your question, that is fantastic. I find that for me, it's leveraging my unique qualification of making myself vulnerable. So if I came at people and was just like, I'm confident and I'm a great speaker and I'm this and I'm that and I've done this and that, it's also showing that behind the curtain version of myself, right? Like I have effed up a heck of a lot of times. I just effed up in a training I did for a client, and thankfully someone called me out and with such generosity and grace. And so I have to take that opportunity to be a do-betterer, but also to say, like, I'm human too. And so I think relating to people who may not have found their voice by sharing the real truth of what it was like for me when I didn't have my voice. I mean, I tell people I went to therapy, and I'm a big proponent of therapy, but therapy is really the big key for me finding my voice again. And that's years of therapy. So it's not a small deal, but I think relating to people where they're at and putting myself back into when I was in those shoes helps them feel, connects the dots between me and them, if that makes sense.
Right. No, it does. And thank you. Thank you for asking that.
John, good to see.
Yeah, good to see you too. I hope we can all connect again soon.
Yes, yes.
Sounds good, Sean. Thanks so much for being here today and for sharing your question. Okay, so Kwabana's hand is up as well. We always appreciate when people return to our podcast week after week, and Kwabana is one of those individuals. And so thanks for being here. Share your question or comment.
Thank you. Good morning, family. And thank you, Neha and Dr. White. This has been very inspiring and enlightening. Some of the jewels that I've been able to take away is grow your value, or know your value, grow your value, show your value. I had to write that one down. And then Dr. White, when you also reiterated her quote on get to know yourself with grace and wonder. And it's especially that wonder, like just taking that time to mentally see who are you now, who were you before, and who are you on your way to becoming. So I appreciate that. That's actually, it hits home for me now. I'm really consciously in that space, which brings me to my question, which actually also touches on Sean's statement. So as we think about some of our DEI leaders, and we talked about assimilation, acculturation earlier, and sometimes in organizations may just put that brown face, kind of that checkbox, like put that brown face who has really assimilated and acculturated to the dominant culture in those DEI leadership roles. And as I was talking to a friend, she said, well, she's got her own mental issues that she needs to deal with herself. Any DNI or DEIB, or I don't know if anybody saw the note, I recently heard Debbie. So diversity, equity, belonging, and inclusion. So what are your thoughts on having not just our IEP, or not IEP, EAP programs, but an actual on-site psychologist to be there for, those who are going through this journey, which, as we know, diversity, equity, inclusion is change management. It's challenging people's norms, values, and the way they've grown up because they're being enlightened. So what are your thoughts around having those types of positions as a part of the overall strategy? And Debbie?
I love the idea of having those resources. My concern would be how effective could they be given the trust issues people might have. Like, I think about HR and how HR is supposed to be the ally of the people, and often it bites people so hard, right? It is like the worst. And I worry about how that could happen if there were like an on-site psychologist or something. But I do think this has to be integrated in everything. I'm a big believer in de-siloing. I'm a big believer in wellness is a grassroots thing, right? Like well-being should be part of how, inclusion should be part of how everyone does their job. Everyone should do their job inclusively. Everyone should do their job to foster well-being. So I do think there's a great role for experts in mental health and all those sort of things in wellness to actually embed some of that work and train the trainer sort of thing, like embed sort of that work from top down or from bottom up in the organization completely. I totally agree with that. And the point you made earlier about I don't know if it's the token brown person, like who are in these positions of power. And sometimes they're people that are more geared towards assimilating than they are people who are going to shake things up. You have just like put your finger on the pulse of where I want to go with my work. That is, I literally just posted on LinkedIn this week, don't teach someone to navigate the minefield when you have the power to remove the mines.
Oh, I saw that. That's so good.
Because I keep seeing this happen. There are plenty of people who shake things up, but then there are some who have forgotten they ever wanted to shake things up. And that becomes really painful for the rest of us. So I wanted to also just kind of reflect back on what you shared about that.
Thank you. It's not necessarily their fault, right?
It's not. They could be.
It's not about the shame or the guilt or anything like that. That's what they had to do. They had to adapt to survive.
Right.
So how do you honestly address that?
Exactly. They've had to adapt to survive. They're probably tapped out. I mean, because they've had to work 3 times as hard to get that far. There are so many reasons why it's not on them. But I do think that for some of us, we don't realize the power we have. And I think it's important to constantly be assessing, the power I have 3 decades into my career is different than even a decade ago. How am I going to leverage that power? Of course, maintaining my well-being first. That has to be first.
Yeah.
But with whatever spoons I have left, how am I going to shake things up?
Thank you so
Love
much.
it. Thank you so much, Pavana. We appreciate you being here and you sharing your question. We are unfortunately out of time. And I say unfortunately because I know this conversation could go on and still continue to reach so many different heights of like great gems and nuggets. But I am so grateful for your time. I do want to let this audience know that we have shared into the chat ways in which you can connect with Neha. And it has, of course, her Belong Lab website, as well as information for connecting with her on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. That quote that you just mentioned that you shared on LinkedIn, it gave me pause. And I just literally sat and I was like, wow. So I do want to mention, and hopefully we can get this into the chat before we log off. You published an article that's called Walking a Minefield Without a Map: The Explosive Intersection of Well-Being and Belonging. So a lot of the sentiments, I'm sure, that probably found its way into that article you've referenced today. So I certainly want to deposit that as a resource for this community. This has been delightful. I'm so grateful for you, grateful we were able to share this time in this space. I want to give you the final 60 seconds just to close this out in whatever way that feels appropriate to you. Thank you.
Dr. White, thank you so much. This has been truly, truly enjoyable for me. So thank you for giving me a wonderful Friday morning. How to close this out? Let me say this. We have a week ahead of us with a holiday in which we're celebrating gratitude. Build into your gratitude practice, not just what you're grateful for that's circumstantial, the people outside of you that you're grateful for. Add an item on your gratitude list. What are you grateful to yourself for? And that's a really important way for you to understand that there's so much in the world that the world gives to you so much, but also you give back to the world in such meaningful ways. So as you go into the gratitude week, I would encourage you to think about that. Please connect with me. I would love to connect with all of you on LinkedIn and otherwise. Thank you, Dr. White, and everyone on your team who has been just fantastic.
Thank you so much, Neha. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving to all, and we will see you in 2023. Thanks so very much.